The desert carried its silence like a secret, stretching wide beneath a pale sky just beginning to blush with the colors of dawn. The land was vast, endless in its reach, and yet within that immensity lived a single man, Everett Thorne, who carried his solitude like armor. His cabin was no more than timber and stone pressed together by time and stubborn hands, but to him it was a fortress, walls that had long guarded him from memories he refused to face. Nights were harsher than days in this land, not for the chill alone, but for the way shadows pressed into a man's chest, whispering reminders of what he once had and had lost. Each night, Everett's dreams broke him in the same way. Gunfire split the air like lightning over mountains. Smoke coiled against the wind, heavy and stifling, swallowing the faces of men who fought and fell. Amidst the chaos, there was always a child, dark eyes wide with terror, tiny fingers clutching at his blood-soaked shirt. He remembered the weight of her against his chest as he carried her away from the carnage. In dreams, she slipped from his arms. In dreams, he always woke with sweat chilling his back, his breath clawing at his throat, and the echo of her cries sinking deep into silence. Morning after morning, he told himself he was done remembering. He rose before the sun touched the ridges, drew water from the well, checked the fences, and worked the earth with the determination of someone who needed his hands occupied lest his heart betray him. The well was his anchor, its cool depths keeping him alive in ways beyond thirst. As long as it gave water, the land yielded crops, and Everett endured. Yet, even in the monotony, there was a restless ache in him. He knew loneliness too well, knew the way it seeped into the bones and twisted the mind until silence felt safer than laughter, until solitude felt less painful than the risk of love. Once, long ago, he had known a wife's gentle smile, the light weight of an infant's head resting against his chest, the joy of believing tomorrow would bring more than survival. Fever had taken them both, and with them it had taken the softer parts of him. Since then he had become stone, hard, unyielding, carved into something the desert might claim without protest. But fate is never content with stone. Fate seeks cracks, the smallest fracture where light might enter. It happened on one of those mornings when the sun was merciless, baking the soil until it seemed nothing could grow, when Everett heard the distant rhythm of hooves. His body tightened, every instinct sharpened by years as a lawman who had long since laid down his badge, but never the habit of vigilance. Strangers in this land rarely meant kindness. He set his hand against the revolver at his hip, and narrowed his gaze against the shimmering horizon. A lone rider emerged through the haze, a figure upright despite the wear of a long journey. Dust clung to her dress, her braids were heavy with the weight of the trail, and her horse staggered beneath exhaustion. She stopped at his well, the very heart of his life, and raised her eyes to him, eyes as dark and steady as the ones that haunted his dreams. "Water," she said, her voice clear despite her cracked lips. "For my horse." Something ancient stirred in him, a memory sharp as the sting of a fresh wound. He nodded, watching as she drew water with practiced strength, tending to her horse with quiet dignity. When the animal drank its fill, she turned, squared her shoulders, and met his gaze. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone resolute, almost ceremonial. "I have come to marry you. I am the Apache child you saved 20 years ago." The world seemed to tilt. Her words dropped into the dust between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through the silence of his carefully ordered life. He felt the ground shift beneath his boots as memories surged, smoke, blood, the cries of a terrified girl, his arms wrapped around her fragile frame as bullets whistled overhead. For years he had convinced himself it was only a dream, another nightmare stitched together from loss. Yet here she stood, flesh and blood, the child grown into a woman. And in that instant, Everett Thorne understood something he had fought for decades to deny. The past had found him. She did not bow her head or soften her words. Instead, she stood as if she had carried this moment across deserts, storms, and years of abandonment. Her presence was not a plea, but a declaration. In her eyes lived the weight of survival, scars he could not yet see, and a promise that she would not be turned aside. Everett wanted to tell her to leave, to push her back into the vastness of the desert before she could dismantle the fragile walls he had built, but the words would not form. For the first time in years, the silence of his land no longer felt safe. It felt broken, stirred by something dangerous, something healing. Night crept over the horizon as she took shelter in his barn, her voice a low hum carried on the wind. Everett sat at his small wooden table, his journal open before him, pen unmoving. He stared at the blank page, torn between writing her name and shutting the book forever. His revolver lay within reach, the comfort of old habits whispering to him, yet his thoughts strayed to the woman who had appeared like a ghost from another life. Sleep eluded him. He stepped outside, the stars scattering across the endless sky, and found himself listening for her voice, faint through the desert air, a sound not unlike prayer, not unlike defiance. The well reflected the moonlight, its surface shimmering. Everett looked into its depths and saw not only his reflection, but hers, shadowed behind him like a promise he did not yet understand. He did not know then that her arrival would awaken not just old memories, but also the parts of himself he had buried with his wife and child. He did not know that water would become more than survival, that it would become healing, renewal, and the start of a story that would carry him from despair into something tender, something fierce, something unbreakable. For love, when it comes, is not always gentle. Sometimes it arrives like a rider out of the desert, dusty, scarred, and unrelenting, carrying the weight of the past, but offering the chance of a future. So began the story of Everett Thorne and Ayana beneath the vast sky of the Arizona Territory, where silence was broken and solitude surrendered. And as you listen to this tale unfold, let it touch something tender within you. Let the healing rhythms of their journey remind you that even the most weathered heart can find renewal. If their story brings you comfort or hope, I invite you, gently, warmly, to share your thoughts below. Leave a like, add your comment, and subscribe, not just for their love, but for all the stories yet to come, stories that may offer you the same warmth, the same quiet strength, and the same reminder that no soul is ever truly lost in the desert of life, not if it chooses to remember love. The sun climbed higher, flooding the desert with its searing gold, and Everett found himself listening to the rhythm of another's footsteps across his yard. For years the sound of his own boots had been the only measure of time, each step across the dry earth echoing against silence. Now there was a second cadence, lighter yet steady, carrying with it the promise that his solitude was no longer his own. Ayana moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to survive where others faltered. Already she had drawn water from the well and tended the chickens without waiting to be asked, her hands sure as if she had belonged to this land all her life. Everett stood at the porch, his arms crossed, watching her scatter grain into the dust. The sun caught in her hair, turning it to strands of black silk, and though her dress was worn and patched, she wore it like a banner of resilience. He told himself he should not grow accustomed to her presence. She would leave soon, once she realized he had no intention of fulfilling the wild declaration she had made upon arrival. Yet each small act unsettled him. The way she wasted nothing at breakfast, how she cleaned the plate without needing instruction, how she lifted her gaze to meet his without fear or hesitation. Her steadiness pressed against the hollow places inside him, places he had convinced himself could never be filled. By mid-morning, they walked the fence line together, repairing sagging posts beneath the hammering sun. Everett had expected to work alone, as always, but she followed without question, her hands quick to learn, her strength surprising. When the wire bit into her palms, she did not flinch. When the post resisted the earth, she leaned her weight into the task with quiet determination. He stole glances at her, at the set of her jaw, at the scars that peeked beneath torn fabric when the wind shifted her dress. They spoke of cruelty inflicted by unseen hands, yet she bore them without complaint, carrying her pain as if it were a stone she had long since learned to balance. "Who did that to you?" The question slipped from him before he could stop it, his voice rough with something he did not wish to name. Her hands paused, but she did not look at him. "It does not matter now," she said softly. "It matters to me if you are staying here." Her head lifted then, dark eyes glinting with both surprise and caution. "Why should it matter to you, Mr. Thorne?" He had no answer ready. All he knew was that the sight of her scars had set something smouldering in his chest, a fire not of pity, but of anger, anger at the world, at the men who had marked her, at the endless cruelty of fate. And beneath that anger was something more dangerous, the first crack in the stone walls he had built around himself. That evening, when the desert cooled and the first stars glimmered across the sky, they sat together on the porch. She took the step below him, leaving space between them, her posture respectful yet unyielding. For a while they listened to the sounds of night, the cry of a coyote, the soft shuffle of the horse in the corral, the hush of wind across dry grass. "Your people," Everett said at last, his voice low. "Why did they cast you out?" She kept her hands folded in her lap, her voice calm as she told him, because she had survived when others had died, because fever and superstition had claimed more lives than bullets, and someone had to be blamed. Because in their eyes her survival was an omen. She spoke without self-pity, her tone as even as the desert horizon. Everett listened, his jaw tight, his chest tightening with every word. He had buried his own pain in silence, but hearing hers spoken aloud felt like a healing balm, even as it seared. The two of them, so different, yet bound by wounds that time alone could not mend. "Why marriage?" he asked after a long silence. "Why not simply ask for shelter or work?" She turned her gaze to the sky, where constellations shimmered like prayers. "A woman alone has no standing," she said. "I have seen what becomes of those with no protection. I will not become that. And you, You already carried me once, when no one else would." I remembered. Her words struck him deeper than any bullet ever had. He had carried many in his life, wives of settlers, wounded deputies, children lost in chaos. But the memory of that one small girl clinging to him as the world burned had never left him. He had buried it, yes, but never forgotten. That night, when he lay on his narrow bunk, he did not reach for the revolver at his side. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened to the faint sound of her moving in the barn, the quiet murmur of her voice as she soothed her horse. For the first time in years, the silence of the desert did not feel empty. It felt alive, threaded with the fragile presence of another soul. Days folded into one another with the rhythm of shared work. They mended fences, weeded stubborn soil, and tended to the animals side by side. Everett found himself watching her when she was not looking, the concentration in her brow as she wove reeds into small patterns, the way her hands, though scarred, created beauty from what the land offered. Sometimes, when the wind was soft, he caught her humming melodies that carried the echo of forgotten ceremonies. They wrapped around him like healing threads, stitching together pieces of a heart he had thought forever torn. One night he woke to find a faint glow near the well. Moving silently, as he once had in darker days, he approached and saw her kneeling by the water. A small fire of herbs burned in a clay dish, its smoke rising like a prayer. She murmured words he could not understand, holding a leather pouch over the flame before dropping it gently into the well. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice carrying more wonder than rebuke. She turned quickly, startled but unashamed. "A ceremony for the spirits of the water," she said. "To thank them for their gift." He looked at the well, then back at her. The rational part of him wanted to scoff, yet something in the stillness of the night, the scent of the herbs, and the quiet reverence in her posture held him silent. "My wife once told me water was God's first miracle," he murmured without meaning to. Her eyes softened. Then she was wise. The memory of Elizabeth sliced through him like a blade, yet Ayana's presence turned it into something gentler, like a scar traced tenderly instead of torn open. For the first time, he spoke aloud of his loss, the fever, the child taken too soon, the emptiness that had driven him into exile. She listened, offering no interruption, no hollow comfort, only the strength of her silence. "I am sorry for your loss," she said finally, and the simplicity of her words carried more healing than any elaborate consolation. The well glimmered between them, reflecting both their faces, scarred and weary, yet bound by something neither had expected, the faint glimmer of trust. When Everett finally returned to his bed, he lay awake long into the night. For years he had chosen silence over speech, solitude over connection, but now there was a voice in his world other than his own. It unsettled him, yes, but beneath the unease was something he feared even more: hope. And as the stars wheeled above the desert and Ayana's voice drifted softly from the barn, Everett Thorne realized that the life he had built alone was already beginning to change. The morning broke with a sky so wide and clear it seemed the world had been washed clean overnight. Everett stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and saw Ayana already moving through the yard. She had risen before him, drawn water from the well, and was scattering grain for the chickens with the steady patience of someone who understood the rhythm of survival. Her long braids caught the light, her movements measured and unhurried, carrying an air of calm that soothed the restless edges of his thoughts. He stood watching longer than he meant to, feeling something shift inside him, like a desert stone rolled by years of wind until its sharpness softened. He had grown used to silence, to solitude, pressing down like a second skin. But now that silence was broken by the simple sounds of another presence, footsteps across the yard, the murmur of her voice to the horse, the scrape of a bucket against stone. Each sound touched him, unsettling and healing all at once. When she noticed him, she straightened and brushed the dust from her skirt. "Good morning," she said, her tone gentle but firm, as though she were stating a truth rather than offering a greeting. Everett only nodded at first, unused to the small courtesies that stitched days together. But then he found himself saying, "You've been busy." "Work needs doing," she replied simply. "I will earn my keep." Those words lingered with him through the morning. Together they shared a meal, and for the first time in years, Everett set another plate across the table. She ate carefully, wasting nothing, savoring each bite with the discipline of someone who had known hunger too well. When she washed her dish afterward without being asked, he felt a curious tug in his chest. An ache and a comfort, woven so tightly together he could not separate them. Later, they worked side by side, repairing the northern fence. Everett found himself surprised by her knowledge, how she tested posts for firmness, how she stretched wire with quick hands, how she endured the sun without complaint. He watched her in quiet moments, noticing the scars along her arms when her sleeves slipped, the faint stiffness in her movements that spoke of wounds far older than the desert wind. Yet she moved with grace, each action a declaration that she was not broken, only remade. At midday they sat in the shade of the porch with cups of cool water between them. The air shimmered with heat, but the silence between them was different now, no longer heavy, but threaded with an unspoken trust. He found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask another soul. "How did you survive after Cedar Creek?" he asked, surprising himself with his own voice. She turned the cup in her hands before answering. "For a time, I lived among my people, but sickness came. Fever took many. The old ones said I carried bad luck, that to survive when others perish is to bring imbalance. So they turned their faces from me." Her voice remained steady, but Everett felt the weight of her words like stones pressing into the dust. He clenched his jaw. "That's superstition. You were a child. None of that was your fault." "To them, it was reason enough," she said softly. "When the world is harsh, people seek someone to blame." She lifted her gaze to his. "You know this truth too." He swallowed, the memory of his wife and daughter rising unbidden, the fever that had swept them away no matter how tightly he had held them. He had blamed himself, blamed God, blamed the world, until there was nothing left but silence. Her words cut into that silence, sharp yet strangely healing. "Why marriage?" he asked, his tone harsher than intended. "Why not ask for shelter or a place to work?" Her eyes met his without flinching. "Because a woman alone has no standing. I will not become a shadow with no name. And because you carried me once when no one else would." I remembered. The truth in her voice pierced deeper than he cared to admit. He turned away, staring out at the vast desert, but her words echoed inside him long after. That night, unable to sleep, Everett stepped outside and found her kneeling by the well again. A small fire burned in a clay dish, its smoke rising in fragrant spirals. She murmured words in her tongue, a prayer carried into the night. He approached, silent as he had been in his days as a lawman. "What are you doing?" She looked up calmly. "A ceremony to honor the water, to thank the spirits for their gift." He glanced at the well. "My wife used to say water was God's first miracle, bringing life to dust." Her expression softened. She was wise. The memory of Elizabeth tightened his chest, but instead of pain, there was something gentler, like a scar touched tenderly instead of torn open. He spoke of her for the first time in years, of the fever, of the baby taken too soon. Ayana listened in silence, offering no false comfort, only the steady strength of her presence. "I am sorry for your loss," she said at last, and her sincerity filled the night with a warmth he had not felt in years. The well shimmered with reflected starlight, their faces mirrored side by side on its surface. For the first time, Everett felt that his solitude was no longer unshakable. Something had shifted. The stone within him had cracked, and through it seeped a glimmer of hope, fragile and healing. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of shared work. They mended fences, tended the garden, and carried water from the well together. He caught her humming sometimes, soft melodies that wove through the air like threads of peace. At night he dreamed still of Cedar Creek, but now her face appeared not as a child terrified, but as the woman beside him, her gaze steady, her presence unyielding. Yet beneath the calm, Everett felt the world stirring. Strangers had begun to ride through the territory more often, men with sharp eyes and sharper intentions. The railroad had been pushing westward, buying land and water, and rumor whispered of disputes waiting to ignite. He had thought himself beyond the reach of such troubles, content in his solitude. But Ayana's presence, her past entwined with his own, had already changed the course of his days. And when hoofbeats thundered across the ridge one afternoon, bringing with them the first shadow of Victor Reynolds and the claim he carried, Everett knew that the fragile healing they had found together would soon be tested by fire. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over hard earth broke the fragile calm of Agua Fria. Everett set down his hammer on the barn roof and narrowed his gaze toward the horizon, where a plume of dust curled against the sun. Visitors were rare in this stretch of land, visitors in wagons rarer still. He climbed down, brushing wood shavings from his shirt, his hand instinctively near the revolver at his hip. Ayana emerged from the garden, her arms filled with a basket of beans and squash, her dark eyes steady as they met his. "Company," he muttered, low enough for her ears alone. She gave a small nod, her shoulders straightening, but she obeyed when he murmured, "Stay back. Let me handle this." The wagon rolled into view, sleek and well-sprung, drawn by a pair of black horses too fine for these rough trails. At the reins sat a tall man in a dark coat, his posture rigid, his face pale beneath a neatly trimmed beard. He looked out of place here, a figure carved from some eastern city and dropped into the desert's dust. He halted the wagon near the well, then stepped down with calculated grace. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying an Eastern accent Everett recognized instantly, the kind of man who thought laws bent to gold and influence. "That's right," Everett replied evenly. "My name is Victor Reynolds. I represent the Arizona and Pacific Railroad Development Company." He reached for a handshake. Everett did not take. If Reynolds noticed, he did not falter. "I've come to discuss an opportunity of mutual benefit." Everett's jaw tightened. "What sort of opportunity?" "You're well." Reynolds's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "It sits at a critical juncture for our planned spur line. Our company is prepared to purchase it for a very generous sum." "It isn't for sale." Reynolds' expression did not shift, though his eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "I understand attachment, Mr. Thorne. Truly. But water in this land is more valuable than sentiment. You may want solitude, but the world does not wait for hermits. The world builds forward, with or without you." "I said it isn't for sale." Everett's voice was quiet, but the finality in it rang sharp. Reynolds withdrew a folded paper from his coat. "Then perhaps this will interest you." He extended it, and Everett hesitated before taking it, scanning the neat legal language stamped with the territorial seal. It spoke of disputed boundaries, suggested the well lay beyond the limits of his deed. "That's a lie," Everett said flatly. "Confusion in the records," Reynolds countered, still calm. "Nothing personal, but my company's claim is strong. And disputes like these, well, they tend to favor progress." His gaze flicked past Everett, catching on the figure standing silent near the garden. Ayana had stepped forward, the sun catching the defiance in her eyes. "The water spirits chose this place," she said, her voice steady. "They will not be moved by paper or greed." Reynolds studied her for a long beat, then let his smile curve cold. "And who might this be?" "None of your concern," Everett growled. "On the contrary," Reynolds said smoothly, "her presence here might be of considerable interest to territorial authorities. New regulations concerning tribal movement are very clear. An Apache woman living on your property without proper arrangement? That could complicate matters." Ayana did not flinch. "I am not afraid of such men," she said quietly. Reynolds' smile sharpened. "Perhaps you should be." He stepped back into his wagon, reins in hand. "I'll return in 1 week for your answer, Mr. Thorne. I hope it will be favorable, for everyone's sake." The wheels ground against the dust, carrying him away, leaving the air thick with tension. Everett stood long after the wagon vanished, the paper crumpled in his hand. Ayana's voice broke the silence. "You knew him." "No," Everett muttered, "but he knew me." He looked toward the horizon, jaw clenched. "That makes him dangerous." That night, Everett could not sleep. He sat at his table with the lamp low, the disputed claim spread before him. Ayana sat nearby, her needle gliding through indigo cloth, quiet but not absent. At last she spoke. "You carry anger like a wound." He glanced at her, then away. "He'll use the law to take everything, and if that fails, he'll use worse." "Then we face him," she said simply, as though speaking of weather or work. Everett exhaled, his chest tight. "I don't want you caught in the middle." Her needle paused, but she did not look up. "I was caught the moment I came to you. I chose this place. I chose you." The words pressed into him like balm against fire, healing but searing all the same. The following day, Everett saddled Buck at dawn. "We're going to town," he told her. "I need to speak to someone who knows the law better than I do. Judge McCoy. Retired, but sharp." Ayana met his gaze, her horse already waiting. "Then I ride with you." He wanted to argue, but something in her tone left no room. They rode together through the desert, the silence between them companionable. When Meridian Crossing rose from the heat haze, Ayana tensed, her back straight in the saddle. Everett leaned toward her. "Stay close. Let me do the talking." The town was small but watchful. Eyes followed them, the reclusive ex-marshal and the Apache woman at his side. Whispers rode the dust as they dismounted outside Macready's store. Everett tied the horses and murmured, "You have as much right to be here as anyone." Inside, they gathered supplies, Ayana choosing fabric with care. But when the door swung open and Sheriff Dawson entered, Everett stiffened. Dawson had once been his deputy. Now he wore the badge with ambition shining in his eyes. "Well, well," Dawson drawled, "if it isn't the hermit of Agua Fria. And who's this?" His gaze slid to Ayana, suspicion behind his cordial smile. "This is Ayana," Everett said firmly. "She's staying long?" Dawson asked, voice mild, but his meaning sharp. "She's with me." Everett's tone cut through the store's stillness. Dawson's smile lingered, but his eyes measured Everett carefully. "Word of advice, Thorne." "There's a new judge in the territory, McCullum, stickler for propriety. If you want to keep peace, you might consider making things official. Papers have a way of smoothing questions." Ayana stood silent, her chin high, while Everett's jaw locked. They finished their business quickly, but as they left town, she asked, "What did he mean by papers?" "He meant marriage," Everett muttered. The word hung heavy between them all the way back across the desert, the weight of it pressing against the silence, forcing both to consider what neither had yet dared to name. By the time the homestead came into sight, the air between them was taut with unspoken thoughts. Ayana dismounted and touched the well, her fingers trailing against the cool stone. "Water remembers," she murmured, her voice carrying both prayer and certainty. Everett stood beside her, the heat of the day pressing down, the memory of Reynolds' smile burning in his chest. For the first time in years, Everett Thorne knew his solitude was gone. His land was no longer his alone, and the fight that loomed on the horizon would not be his alone to bear. The ride back from Meridian Crossing lingered heavy in Everett's chest, every hoofbeat of Buck striking against thoughts he could not silence. Dawson's words about papers circled like vultures in his mind. Marriage, he had said it plain enough, not as promise or affection, but as shield, as proof to men like Reynolds or McCullum that Ayana's presence was legitimate. Everett hated the thought of the law deciding the worth of what they built, yet hated more the thought of Ayana cast aside, treated as trespass on his own land. Beside him, Ayana rode with her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not ask again what the sheriff had meant. She already knew. She carried her silence like a mantle, but Everett sensed the storm beneath it. At Agua Fria, twilight stretched across the desert, the well shimmering faintly in the dying light. They dismounted, and Ayana went at once to tend her horse. Everett busied himself with the chickens, but his gaze kept straying to her. Her hands steady on leather straps, her hair falling loose from its braid, the set of her shoulders firm despite the weight she bore. That night, after supper, Everett sat at the table, revolver in hand, oiling each piece before setting it back in place. The familiar ritual steadied him, but his thoughts would not still. Ayana sat across from him, working with the indigo fabric she had chosen in town. Her fingers moved surely, shaping something useful out of simple cloth. "Why did you become a lawman?" she asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Everett glanced up, caught by surprise. No one had asked him that in years. He considered a long while before answering. "My father wore the badge, sheriff in Texas. I grew up believing in it. Believing a man could stand between the innocent and harm." "And you did," she said softly. "I tried," he admitted, his gaze lowered to the revolver pieces before him. "Until Sabina's, a robbery gone wrong. 3 men dead, 1 boy, no more than 16, caught in the crossfire." His jaw tightened. "I laid down the badge after that. Couldn't trust myself to know right from wrong anymore." Ayana's hands stilled, fabric resting in her lap. "It was not your fault." "Doesn't matter," Everett said, his voice rough. "It was my responsibility." Silence settled again, but it was different now, no longer distance, but something shared, like 2 wounds laid bare to the same moonlight. In the days that followed, life settled into a rhythm shaped by both of them. Ayana's presence threaded into every corner of the homestead. She rose early to draw water, scattered grain with a sure hand, mended worn shirts with skillful stitches. Her songs, sometimes no more than hums, sometimes words Everett could not understand, carried across the yard like healing threads, softening the sharp edges of silence that had once ruled here. Everett found himself listening for her voice, as though it steadied him more than the revolver at his side. He caught himself watching her at work, not with suspicion as before, but with something warmer, quieter, more dangerous. The way she bent to tend the soil, coaxing stubborn shoots to life. The way her laughter slipped free one evening when the horse nipped at her sleeve. It startled him more than gunfire, that laughter. It slipped past defenses he had thought unbreakable. But the shadow of Reynolds did not lift. One hot afternoon, a wagon rolled into the yard, dust rising behind it. Everett stiffened the moment he saw the black horses, the fine coat of the man who climbed down. Reynolds again, this time with papers heavier, his voice silkier, his threat sharper. He spoke of disputed claims, of progress, of how the railroad could not be stopped. And when Ayana stepped forward, chin high, speaking of water spirits and belonging, Reynolds's eyes gleamed with something cruel. "An unauthorized resident," he said, smiling thin. "That will interest the authorities." Everett's fists tightened, but he held steady. He waited until Reynolds drove off before letting his jaw unclench. Ayana's gaze found his. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Everett agreed. "But neither will we." That night he rode with her to Judge McCoy's small adobe house at the edge of town. The retired judge was older now, bent but sharp-eyed, his home stacked high with books and papers. He listened as Everett laid out the dispute, the threats, the paper Reynolds had carried. McCoy's frown deepened as he examined the document. "Reynolds," he muttered. "I know the name. His brother, Nathan, was at Cedar Creek." His eyes cut sharp to Ayana, then back to Everett. "The man has reason for his grudge. He'll use the law if he can. If that fails, he'll use guns." "Can he win?" Everett asked. McCoy set the paper down, leaning back heavily. "The land's yours. I know the surveyor who marked it, drunk fool but careful with water. Still, Reynolds has money, influence, friends in high places. He'll push. And with that Apache woman living under your roof—" He glanced toward Ayana. "The law may twist against you." Ayana met his scrutiny without flinching. "I am not afraid." McCoy's voice softened a fraction. "Bravery won't matter to men like him, but a marriage certificate might." The words struck like iron. Everett's gut twisted, memories of Elizabeth pressing sharp. But McCoy's reasoning was clear. 2 lives tied together, legally, carried more weight than one man standing alone. Outside, beneath the stars, Ayana walked beside him in silence. At last she said, "Do not decide for me, Everett Thorne. I chose to come to you. Whatever comes, I will stand." He looked at her then, really looked. The strength carved by years of loss, the quiet dignity, the scars she carried like banners. Something inside him loosened, something long locked away. He did not answer. But when he lay down that night, his dreams held not just Cedar Creek's smoke and gunfire, but Ayana's voice weaving through the darkness, steady, healing, alive. And when dawn came, Everett knew the battle with Reynolds was only beginning. But for the first time in years, he no longer felt he would fight it alone. The days that followed their meeting with Judge McCoy carried a strange stillness, like the pause between thunder and lightning. Everett worked from dawn to dusk with a vigilance sharpened by years of caution, yet Ayana's presence softened each hour in ways he had never expected. Her voice, her steady hands, the unshakable rhythm she brought to his solitary homestead, each thread wove into his life until solitude no longer felt natural but fractured, as though something vital had been missing all along. He caught himself watching her as they worked side by side. She coaxed life from the earth with a patience he could never summon, her fingers finding tender shoots hidden in stubborn soil. She tended the animals with quiet reverence, murmuring words in her tongue that seemed to soothe even the restless bay gelding who had carried Everett for years. At night, when she hummed beneath her breath, the sound wrapped around him like a balm, easing scars that had never healed clean. He told himself it was only the comfort of companionship, but deep down he knew it was more, a warmth seeping through the cracks of stone he had built around himself. One evening, when the air cooled and the first stars blinked across the wide sky, Everett found her seated by the well. The water shimmered with moonlight, her reflection trembling across its surface. She was silent, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze lost in the depths below. Everett lowered himself onto the porch step, not speaking, simply letting the night hold them both. After a long while, she lifted her eyes to him. "Do you believe water remembers?" she asked. He thought of Elizabeth, of their child, of every prayer unanswered. He thought of the day he pulled a terrified girl from the smoke and carried her to safety. "Maybe," he said at last. "Maybe it remembers what we cannot forget." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something gentler, something healing. "Then it remembers kindness too." The words struck him deeper than any bullet ever had. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps memory was not only pain, perhaps it could be the seed of renewal. The following morning, Everett saddled Buck. "We ride to town," he said, his voice carrying a weight he had not spoken aloud. "McCoy's right. If Reynolds pushes, we need papers in order." Ayana met his gaze steadily. "You mean marriage?" He hesitated, then nodded once. The judge wasn't wrong. A homestead bound by law is harder to steal. She stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. Marriage should not be only a shield, it should be a choice. He searched her face, the scars, the quiet dignity, the strength carved from years of exile and survival. His throat tightened. "I don't know if I can give love again," he admitted, the words scraping raw from his chest. "But I can give partnership, respect, a place where you belong." Ayana's hand rose, light as a feather, resting against his arm. "That is enough." They rode together into Meridian Crossing, the town buzzing with whispers at the sight of them. Everett felt the weight of every stare, but Ayana rode tall, her chin lifted, her presence commanding in its quiet certainty. At Judge McCoy's small adobe house, the old man received them with his usual gruffness, yet his eyes softened when he saw Ayana stand beside Everett without hesitation. The ceremony was simple. Words spoken, papers signed, Sheriff Dawson and 2 clerks as witnesses. No flowers, no church bells, only the well-worn porch of McCoy's home and the desert wind carrying their vows into the wide horizon. Yet when Ayana's voice joined Everett's in that steady declaration, something inside him shifted. Not love, not yet, but a choice, a deliberate step into a future no longer carried alone. On the ride home, the sun dipped low, painting the desert in gold and crimson. Ayana's horse kept pace with Buck, and when Everett glanced at her, he saw a faint smile at the corner of her lips, soft as the desert twilight. At Agua Fria, the homestead looked different, though nothing had changed. The cabin, the barn, the corral, all of it seemed brighter, steadier, no longer the fortress of a solitary man, but the beginning of something shared. That night, as they drew water together from the well, Everett caught their reflections side by side, 2 lives bound now by law, by choice, by quiet determination. "The water remembers," Ayana whispered, her hand brushing his as they lifted the bucket. Everett looked into the dark circle below, and for the first time believed it might be true. But the desert was never still for long. The next morning brought riders, Judge McCoy and Sheriff Dawson returning, 2 clerks with them, faces grave. They carried word of Reynolds, of petitions already filed, of influence buying its way into the ears of Judge McCullum. Trouble was moving faster than even McCoy had feared. Everett listened, jaw set, Ayana silent at his side. When McCoy finished, the air heavy with warning, Everett spoke at last. "Then we'll stand. Whatever he brings, we'll stand together." Ayana's hand brushed his lightly steady, sure. "Together," she echoed. And as the riders departed, leaving dust and silence in their wake, Everett felt the truth of her words settle deep into his bones. For years he had chosen solitude as shield. Now, for the first time, he chose something else. He chose to stand not alone, but with her, against whatever storm was coming. The journey back from Judge McCoy's house was quiet, yet beneath the silence ran a current as steady as the underground waters Ayana spoke of. The papers were signed, the vows spoken. They had returned to Agua Fria no longer as strangers bound by circumstance, but as man and wife, partners before the law, partners in truth. Everett had not thought the land could look any different. Yet as they crested the rise and the cabin came into view, the place no longer seemed only his. It was theirs now. The word carried weight, but also a healing warmth he had not known in years. Ayana moved about the homestead with quiet assurance, tending to chores as though she had always belonged. Her voice carried across the yard when she called softly to her horse. Her laughter, rare but sudden, rang when the chickens chased grain too eagerly. Everett listened without meaning to, each sound threading itself into his memory like the desert wind carrying the scent of rain. In her presence, even silence had changed. It was no longer an empty echo, but a shared stillness, one that soothed rather than consumed. But trouble did not wait long to show itself. It began with small signs. A door he was certain he had latched, standing ajar. Tracks near the corral that did not belong to Buck or Ayana's mare. A faint unease in the air, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. Then, one afternoon, returning from checking the northern fence, Everett saw the cabin door hanging open wide, swaying in the hot wind. He raised his hand, signaling Ayana to stay back, but she slid from her saddle with silent determination, a knife glinting in her hand. Together they stepped into the dim interior. The sight made Everett's chest tighten with rage. The cabin had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, his few possessions scattered across the floor. The mattress slashed open, straw spilling like entrails. This was no robbery. It was a message. Ayana's eyes searched quickly, her breath catching as she moved toward the shelf where she kept a small pouch. Her mother's gift, the last remnant of her people. The pouch was gone. Everett's gaze fell upon a wooden box near his bunk. It lay open, its contents disturbed. Elizabeth's wedding ring remained, but the lock of her hair, his last fragile tether to her, was missing. He felt the loss like a blow. Not valuables. Not food, only the most personal of keepsakes, stolen with deliberate cruelty. Ayana touched the empty space where her pouch had been, her jaw set, her eyes dark with fury, though her voice when it came was calm. Men like him understand the power of memory. He seeks to wound us, not in body, but in spirit. Everett's fists clenched, his breath harsh. Reynolds. Or his men, Ayana agreed. But it is the same hand. They spent the evening restoring what order they could, sweeping away the wreckage, mending what could be mended. Yet the sense of violation lingered, heavier than the desert heat. As night fell, Everett sat at the table, staring at the empty space in the box, while Ayana swept the last of the straw from the floor. Finally, he spoke. Some things cannot be replaced. Ayana paused, leaning on the broom. Her eyes softened, a quiet light in their depths. And some things cannot be taken. What they sought to steal was memory, spirit. But those live within us. They cannot be cut away. Her words, simple and steady, touched something raw in him, and for a moment the weight of rage eased. She crossed the room, set the broom aside, and laid her hand over his. The contact was light, yet it steadied him more than steel ever had. "We will not let him break us," she said. Everett turned his hand, clasping hers, and in that silent bond found strength enough for the night. The next day brought Judge McCoy to their door, with Sheriff Dawson at his side, and 2 clerks carrying maps and papers. They brought grim news. Reynolds had filed his claim sooner than expected. A hearing was scheduled in just 2 weeks, and whispers told of the judge already dining with Reynolds, already being courted by his gold. The odds were stacked. You'll need more than papers, McCoy warned. You'll need the weight of the people behind you. And you'll need to show your homestead is not just land, but life, family, purpose. Everett looked at Ayanna, standing tall beside him. We have that. McCoy nodded, though his eyes lingered on Ayanna, reading the measure of her resolve. Then be ready. He won't play fair. The warning proved true. Word spread of Reynolds's reach, of hired guns seen in nearby towns. Everett reinforced the doors and windows, posted watches through the night. Ayanna took her turn as naturally as drawing water from the well, her knife at her belt, her eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilance of one who had lived too long hunted by shadows. Everett protested once, but she only said, "We face this together." And he could not deny her. One night, unable to sleep, Everett stepped onto the porch where Ayanna sat keeping watch. The stars blazed above them, cold and endless, the well a dark circle at their feet. He lowered himself beside her, silent for a long while. At last he spoke, his voice low. "How did you survive all you endured without breaking?" She turned her gaze from the stars to him, her face calm, her voice soft but firm. "Who says I did not break? We all carry scars, Everett Thorne. But being broken does not mean being destroyed. Sometimes what breaks allows new strength to grow." The words slipped deep into him, settling where grief had long hardened to stone. He thought of his own losses, of how the cracks in him had never healed smooth, but had reshaped him into someone new, someone harder, perhaps, but still standing. Her truth was like water seeping into dry earth, quiet, healing, alive. Before dawn, she touched his arm lightly. "Whatever comes, know this. I am here not from need, but from choice." He turned to her, the honesty in her gaze more binding than any paper signed before witnesses. "Then we'll face it together," he said. When morning broke, the desert seemed changed. Not gentler, its heat still seared, its dust still rose, but Everett felt something in himself steadier than before. The homestead was no longer only a place of survival. It was a place of standing, of belonging, of building, not alone, but side by side. And though Reynolds's shadow loomed darker each day, Everett no longer feared the coming storm. For now he carried not only his own strength, but hers beside him, a bond born of memory, of scars, of choice, a bond that even fire would not undo. The desert held its breath in the hours before nightfall, the horizon painted in streaks of blood-red and molten gold. Agua Fria lay quiet beneath the weight of that silence, though every man and woman who had gathered there knew it was not peace but the tense stillness before a storm. Everett stood at the well, his hand resting on the rough stone, the water within glimmering faintly with the fading light. Ayanna joined him, her presence steady, her gaze calm as the sky darkened. "They will come tonight," she said softly. He nodded. "We'll be ready." Around them, the homestead had been transformed. Neighbors from across the territory had come. Men Everett once helped in distant days. Women Ayanna had quietly welcomed with her calm dignity. Fences had been reinforced, rifles cleaned and loaded, torches set ready to light. The laughter of children was hushed now, tucked away in the barn where they would be safe. The land, once ruled by solitude, now thrummed with the shared heartbeat of a community willing to stand against the railroad's shadow. As darkness fell, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the still air. Torches flared on the eastern ridge, a line of riders moving fast, their flames cutting through the night like the claws of some vast predator. Everett's grip tightened on his rifle. Ayana stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm with quiet assurance. "They carry fire," she murmured. "But we carry something stronger." The riders came hard, their shouts splitting the night, their torches hurled toward barn and house. But Agua Fria did not yield. Gunfire cracked sharp, defenders holding their ground with discipline. Everett moved like the lawman he had once been, his shots deliberate, his voice steady as he called commands. Beside him, Ayana fired without flinching, her dark braid whipping in the wind, her eyes fierce with the fire of survival. The attackers faltered at the first volley, surprised by resistance stronger than they expected. But the fiercest of them pressed on, driving straight toward the well. Everett saw them, 3 men, 1 carrying dynamite. The sight made his blood run cold. "The well!" he shouted. He sprinted, Ayana covering him with sharp, measured fire. He reached the stone circle as one of the men bent to set the charge. Everett tackled him, the 2 rolling in the dust. Another lunged forward, but before Everett could rise, a crack split the night. The man fell, Ayana's rifle steady in her hands. The 3rd dropped the dynamite, fumbling in panic. And then the world erupted. The explosion tore open the earth, not at the well, but just beyond it, where the ground had always seemed strangely hollow. Stone and dust flew skyward, and from the jagged wound in the desert burst a surge of water, clear, powerful, unstoppable. It gushed into the night, a river awakened from centuries of silence, flooding across the dry land. For a breathless moment, battle stilled. Men, women, defenders and attackers alike stared at the miracle unfolding before their eyes. The water poured freely, rushing down gullies, soaking thirsty soil, filling the air with a sound like thunder. Seeds long dormant broke open in the earth, a green haze beginning to spread where moments before only dust had lived. "The great river," Ayana whispered, awe softening her voice. The water spirits remembered. Everett stood drenched, the spray cooling his face, and for the first time in years he felt something deeper than survival. He felt healing, a washing away of grief and dust, a renewal he had thought forever lost. The attackers broke then, their courage drowned by the sight of the earth itself rising against them. They fled into the darkness, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The defenders held their ground, but no more shots were fired. The battle was over. By dawn, Agua Fria had changed. Where dust had ruled, water ran freely. The homestead, once only a solitary refuge, now pulsed with life. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the new spring, their faces lit with wonder. Sheriff Dawson shook his head, his hat in his hands. "Never seen the desert give like this," he muttered. "This water could feed half the territory." Judge McCoy, weary but smiling, placed a hand on Everett's shoulder. "You've done more than defend your home. You've given hope." Everett looked to Ayana, who stood at the water's edge, her hair caught in the morning sun, her face serene. She turned to him, her eyes steady, carrying the strength of years survived, the dignity of scars carried and not hidden. She reached for his hand, and he clasped it, their fingers intertwining like roots drinking from new water. "This is only the beginning," she said softly. "Together Everett replied, his voice sure. The people cheered, their voices carrying across the valley, echoing against mountains. Agua Fria was no longer a place of silence, but of life, of promise, of love reborn in the harshest land. That night, when quiet returned, Everett and Ayana sat by the well, the stars reflected in its surface. He spoke Elizabeth's name aloud without pain, feeling at last that the past had been honored, not buried. Ayana laid her hand over his, her touch steady, healing. "We carry all we have lost," she said. "But now we carry each other too." Everett looked at her, his heart unarmored, his solitude finally surrendered. "Yes," he said, "and the water remembers." Above them, the stars burned brighter, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to the choice they had made, to the future flowing before them like the river newly born. And as their story closed its first chapter and opened another, a gentle truth lingered in the desert air. Even the most broken heart can heal, even the most barren land can bloom, and love, when chosen, when carried with dignity and courage, becomes the well that never runs dry. If this story has touched your heart, if it has brought you warmth or a sense of healing, I invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let your voice join the circle of this tale. Like the video, subscribe for more, and together we will keep these stories alive, flowing like the waters of Agua Fria, renewing the spirit with every word.